Ew.
Yes, they do have a good. I love their seasonal packs. Like every season, they have like a variety pack, and it'll
Yeah.
be, 3 bottles of 4 different beers in the pack. The fall one is excellent, so I'm pumped about that. And I guess we're
That's
live,
right.
and I'm
We're
just
coming up
talking
on,
on the
it'll
air.
be Oktoberfest time
Yeah,
pretty soon.
Places already have Oktoberfest beer out, and that's not right.
no, that
Let us
is
enjoy the
absolutely
summer
right.
beers.
I'm
No,
gonna go to
I
the
wanna,
store and I'm gonna stock up on Oktoberfest and candy corn and will fall to come. Will
Yes.
summer to be over.
it's early August. Respect the seasons, Travis.
No, no.
Yeah, I went to an art supply store to get frames, and everything was already like straw bales and scarecrows and leaves and spooky scaries.
Maybe this can be the topic of the night in the group chat. Is it appropriate to start having fall beers in early August? I'm in the camp of hell no. Travis is in a hard yes.
The Oktoberfest beers, like I look forward to that every year. Like that's the highlight.
Yeah, but you look forward to it because it's only around for a few months. If it's like March, you don't want Oktoberfest.
I
No,
would
but
say I would
like
agree.
August through October is acceptable.
Well, see, I'm with Joe on this one, and that the benefit of an Oktoberfest is you want the air to be a little crispy too. If it's 85 degrees outside, I still want my shandies. I still want, something with a summery kick to it. And Oktoberfest, like, you just
I
can't
mean,
jump the gun.
more for me.
Yeah.
You
All right.
can
Well,
keep the
I'm sure
pumpkin
everyone.
beers. You can take that garbage right out. Like I don't want that, but I
We
want a
can
good
agree on that one. I don't want.
Okay.
I love Oktoberfest beers. I don't want pumpkin anything.
I love pumpkin pie. I love beer. I don't want both at the same time.
So I'm sure everyone's really enjoying our stand on beer flavors. Do we have a thumbs up from Andrea that we're live on all pages?
We're posted. We're on your page too. We're on ours, so we are good to go.
Great,
Cool.
great. All right, so I think some of you guys are already familiar with the concept for tonight. A few weeks ago, we were at Harpers Ferry Brewing doing a live talk. It got soggy, but it was a lot of fun. I know a lot of you guys came out for that. Today, we're going to revisit those stories for the benefit of folks who couldn't join us in person or who might want to hear, maybe a little bit of a different angle with the tales that we are telling. So for an intro, per usual, I'm Andrea Curie-Layson with the Virginia Piedmont Heritage Area. My colleague Travis Shaw is here too, and then we also have Joe Rizzo from the Loudon Museum. Tonight is a special treat because you only have to listen to the three of us. So this is a guest-free segment, which will leave us some more time for questions and comments as we go. So let's go around and just say what we're drinking and then what we're talking about tonight. Joe, what are you doing?
I am drinking Old Baldy American Pilsner from Harpers Ferry Brewing. And I'm talking about a father-son who fight for the Loudon Rangers during the Civil War from the Waterford area. And I will say it's very weather appropriate for this live stream right now, as it's about to start pouring.
Yeah.
So very fitting for what we dealt with in Harpers Ferry a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
History repeats itself. Travis, what about you?
So tonight I'm drinking Ramble On Juicy IPA from Star Hill Brewing. Very, very tasty. It's not an Oktoberfest, but I might have to wait another week or so. And I am going to be talking about a boxing match that got out of hand down near Harpers Ferry in the 1840s.
Awesome. And then tonight I am drinking, I went international tonight. This is a boxed wine. The box says that the wine is from Chile. I can neither confirm nor deny if that is actually the case.
For a classy lady.
Yeah, for all of you at home. And tonight I'm going to be talking about a train heist that was executed by Mosby and his Rangers in 1864. So we're going to go, while we're centered on the map on Harpers Ferry, we've got a bit of a timeline shift here, and we're going to start with our earliest story. Take it away, Travis.
All right, cool. So my story begins in 1811, and it begins on the other side of the Atlantic. In 1811, a young man named James Ambrose was born in County Cork, Ireland. Young James did not live in Ireland long. He grew up on the mean streets of East London. And again, this is like early 19th century industrial revolution, like Charles Dickens London. Pretty rough and tumble in his time. And as a young man, he kind of earned a reputation as a petty thief, a brawler, a troublemaker, not exactly the kind of guy you wanted to run into in a darkened alley. And it's because of this that as a young man, he will be transported to Australia. He receives a sentence. We don't know the crime, but he gets sent to Australia on a 20-year transportation sentence. But young James will only spend 8 years in Australia before escaping from the island, hopping on a freighter, and returning to the United Kingdom. And when he returns, he only stays in the United Kingdom briefly on his return, mostly out of fear that he's going to get caught and sent back to Australia. But he starts around this time, it's about 1840, 1841, starts to develop a reputation as a professional boxer. Now, it's an interesting choice of careers then, because boxing in many places is illegal. And there's really good reason for that. Bare knuckle prize fighting in the 19th century is a brutal sport. It's there really aren't any safety equipment, safety features.
I like to think that it's a smart career choice because everything in Australia is already trying to kill you, so you might as well.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up because a lot of these prize fighters, like Australia becomes a hub for this because you have all these like tough guy criminals that get into this, like James Ambrose. So there's basically fights will last as long as one of the boxers is still standing. So there are recorded instances of fighting boxing matches lasting 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours.
Wow.
Of guys just wailing on each other, bare knuckle. There's no sort of referees or anything. There's a handful of rules, like no gouging, no like hitting below the waist. But other than that, it is an absolute
classy.
It's a brutal sport.
Yeah.
One of the examples I like to use is Ambrose. When he returns to England in 1841, he actually fights a guy named Hammer Lane, who is claiming to be the middleweight champion of England. And so he fights Hammer Lane. It's like a 34-minute fight. So it's fairly short, I guess, by the standards of the day. He beats Hammer Lane by breaking Hammer Lane's arm and then repeatedly just hitting his broken arm until this guy can't take it anymore.
Yikes.
So that should give you an idea of what these fights are like.
It's a sport.
It's a sport. It's something. It makes like modern MMA look tame.
Yeah.
And if like you guys, I'm sure most of you have seen Gangs of New York. There's a bare knuckle boxing scene that takes place on a boat in New York Harbor. Like that's what we're talking about. It's two big guys just pounding each other's faces in. So the same year that he fights Hammer Lane, 1841, James Ambrose will come to America. Like I said, wants to avoid getting sent back to Australia. And he's going to fight in his first official fight in America in Philadelphia that fall. And it's around this time that he takes on nom de guerre. He takes on a stage name, a fighting name, and he will be known for the rest of his career as Yankee Sullivan. Now, Yankee's an odd nickname for a guy from Ireland, but who am I to question? Yankee Sullivan over the next few years is going to become basically a household name in the United States. He earns a reputation as a fighter here in the United States. He actually gets arrested and sent to prison for 2 years in New York City for taking part in a fight in which one of the boxers is killed. He helped organize the fight, so he went to jail. But in between boxing and being on the run from the law, he becomes famous as a enforcer for the Tammany Hall political machine up there in New York. Going around intimidating voters, roughing up people who aren't paying their protection money and things like that. He also runs a saloon for a while in New York City, which again kind of leads to his fame. He's this larger than life character in kind of the slums of New York. So again, that very like Gangs of New York kind of a feel to his story. he becomes beloved by Irish Americans. As more and more Irish come to the United States, especially in the years after the famine, like he's going to be seen as like their champion, like this guy that's out there fighting. He always walks into the ring wearing green and stuff like that. And pretty soon that fame is going to reach back across the Atlantic. And people in Ireland and in the United Kingdom are going to start hearing stories of this Irish prize fighter that's just tearing it up and down the East Coast of the United States. And one of the people that hears this story is a man named Robert Caunt. And that's C-A-U-N-T. So Caunt is how I'm going to pronounce it. Like Gaunt? I don't know. So Robert and his brother Ben are famous English boxers. In fact, Ben Caunt is he's the English heavyweight champion at the time. So they hear about this young upstart Irish boxer who's over in America, kind of winning fights and really building up this legacy. And so Robert decides he is going to challenge Yankee Sullivan for the title of, heavyweight boxer, heavyweight champion of the United States. And he does this by putting out a very public advertisement in the newspaper. This is the equivalent of, I guess, tweeting at someone in the 1840s.
At me, Yankee Sullivan.
That's what he does. He says, quote, "Since my arrival in this country, I have received several challenges from Yankee Sullivan, but have never been able to bring him up to the chalk.
Where are you at?
If he means business, I am ready to fight him for $1,000. And if he will not accept this challenge, I hope he will not annoy me anymore with his bounces." So he's calling Yankee Sullivan out.
This is a must-see fight.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, did you guys hear that?
Yeah,
that thunder?
I'm the same thing. I'm seeing
Yeah.
some pretty good streaks of lightning go by. So if the feed cuts out, it's because, again, true to Harpers Ferry from a couple weeks ago, we are having a pretty good thunderstorm.
Yeah, I was probably right about this place in the story when it started to pour a few weeks ago.
It's a Travis Shaw.
All right, so on one hand, we got Yankee Sullivan, this Irishman. We've got Robert Caunt, this Englishman. So not only is there kind of like there's an ethnic component to this. The English and the Irish don't really mix, don't quite get along, particularly in the 1840s. So, this is being billed as like the fight, between Anglo-Saxons and the Celts. It's a fight between an American immigrant and this British guy who's, wants to come over here and tell us Americans what's what. So there's kind of like a nationalist aspect to it, a very ethnic component to this. Yankee Sullivan agrees, and they schedule the fight for the spring of 1847. And the site that they select, I just froze up.
We can still hear you.
We can hear you.
I don't know what happened. Okay.
Hello.
Yeah, we
still hear me.
So it's Travis audio from now on.
Okay, that's fine. I can go audio.
He's a mime.
So, anyways, the site they select is Harpers Ferry, Virginia. Now, the reason they picked the site, it's far from New York City. It's far from Yankee Sullivan's kind of base of supporters. It's also a little more isolated than any of the big cities because, as I said before, this can be illegal depending on where you're doing it. So as they get ready for the fight, weeks before the fight, Robert Caunt, the Englishman, will arrive in Harpers Ferry. He'll start to train. And over the next few weeks, hundreds of people will arrive in Harpers Ferry to watch this fight. Now, Joe, I don't know. What's the population of Harpers Ferry like in the 1840s? It can't be that big.
It's small. It was declining at that point, too.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a small population.
So basically what happens is 800 or so people show up in Harpers Ferry to watch this fight. And they are, every hotel is occupied, every space in a home or empty building is occupied. People are sleeping on floors. Everyone is getting into town as quickly as they can to watch what is supposed to be the fight of the century.
I love I wonder if there's like a promoter for this too, who's like trying to cash in on this fight.
Oh, I'm sure these guys had promoters. Obviously there's a big cash prize for whoever wins the fight. You know, $1,000 in 1847 is a pretty big chunk
Yeah,
of
for
money.
sure. I'm sure there were some pretty big side bets going on too for this fight.
Yeah, so one observer in town referred to it as a crowd of shoulder hitters and pickpockets that were the utmost terror that prevailed amongst the peaceful inhabitants. So you can imagine every kind of low life person filtering into Harper's Ferry to watch this fight. And this is going to freak out the superintendent of the armory, you know, the big government business in town. He's worried about all these people that are all of a sudden hanging around in town, getting in the way, causing trouble. He's also worried because in his factory, a lot of the people working there are English immigrants from Birmingham or Irish immigrants. And he's worried that this fight is going to lead to a riot between the armory workers. So he basically goes to the promoters and says, you know, if you have this fight in Harper's Ferry, you will be arrested. I'm sending the sheriff. So the promoters come up with a pretty smart scheme. They simply move a few miles outside of Harper's Ferry proper, cross the Jefferson County line, and into the very northwestern tip of Loudoun County. All of a sudden, they're in a different county. The sheriff has no reach there. And conveniently, they're right across the river from Maryland. So if the authorities show up, these guys can hop boats and get across the river. And that's honestly their plan at this point, is like, we may have to bail all of a sudden, which I love.
Speaking of bailing, I'm going to try to stop your video.
Yeah, I'm going to see.
Yeah, so you just went off too. So if you put it back on, it should kind of reset it.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to try to do. Saying that, hold on, video settings.
It's a nice little cliffhanger too.
Yeah, so the fight's about to begin.
If you ever get in a fist fight, always have a getaway by
always have a getaway.
A seafaring getaway.
Yeah, I have no idea why that happened.
I asked you to share your video. Or to start video.
Yeah, it's telling me it failed to start video. Please select another video camera. I don't know what's going on.
Just keep talking, Travis. It's fine.
This is a new computer, so I apologize. Okay, so they move across the Loudoun County line. They find a nice flat meadow to have the fight right across the river from where they can escape. Finally, the morning of May 11th, 1847, they are ready to go. The fight is on. It's pouring rain that day, but a crowd of nearly 800 people show up for the fight. They chalk out a 24-foot circle for the fighters to fight in. Sullivan arrives. He's 5'10", 150 pounds, so not very big. These are not like huge heavyweight fighters like we'd imagine today. Kant was a little bigger, 164 pounds, but despite that, Sullivan was still favored to win the fight. And as we'll see, there's a pretty good reason for that. Right from the get-go, from the first bell, Sullivan has the advantage. He just starts landing blow after blow after blow on Kant. By the third round, Kant is bleeding profusely. He's having trouble seeing because his face is just a bloody mess at this point. He gets a few good hits in, but Sullivan just seems absolutely impervious to everything. And finally, by the sixth round, Kant is actually briefly knocked unconscious. He falls down unconscious for a few moments. So Sullivan is sensing blood. You know, he knows it's time to move in for the kill. So when the seventh round begins, he backs Kant into the ropes and just starts just hammering his face and his head to try and knock him out again. Kant, in a last-ditch effort, actually grapples and tries to throw Sullivan. He tries to wrap his legs around behind Sullivan's legs and push him over, which was legal. You were allowed to do throws and grapples in boxing then. But for some reason, you know, the two of them end up falling to the ground. One of the umpires calls a foul, and the other calls the grapple fair. So we're at an impasse. The two umpires are in disagreement. The referee is going to call a timeout. And during the timeout, Sullivan moves back up to the scratch, up to the chalk. He's ready to go for round number 8. Kant's seconds, like his promoters, the guys with him, refuse and say, no, Kant had you down on the ground, you're out, like he won the fight. You fouled him, the fight is over. Sullivan's men start yelling that no, Yankee Sullivan had him down on the ground, it wasn't a foul, and since Kant won't go up to the scratch, then Kant has forfeited the fight is over. And they start escorting Yankee Sullivan out of the ring, claiming victory. They throw him up on their shoulders and start cheering as if they've won. Well, the fight of the century has only lasted 12 minutes. So you have 800 people that have traveled from all over the East Coast to see this sporting event. And the fight has lasted 12 minutes and nobody knows who has won the fight. I mean, obviously Sullivan's
looking for the sequel, like
right.
Fight of the Century 2.0. Cotton Sullivan, come on back to Harpers Ferry for the rematch.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, Sullivan's had the advantage the entire time. You can find a blow-by-blow account of this fight, and he is just from the get-go has been pounding this guy. But there's enough confusion over the foul that like nobody really wants to call it, and so this is when the crowd goes wild. Remember, I had said that the superintendent was a little worried that this might lead to a riot between the English and the Irish. That's exactly what happens. Sullivan's supporters start going after Kant's supporters. They are brawling in and around the ring. The only thing that finally ends the riot is the rain starts to pour on these guys, and finally that's enough to disperse the crowd. It could have gotten much worse, but 800 angry, probably intoxicated boxing fans led to a riot. Now, a lot of you guys, if you've been to Harpers Ferry, have probably been by the site of the fight without knowing it. So as I said, they had to look for a nice flat open area to accommodate the ring, to accommodate the spectators. The place that they chose, the small meadow where this happened, is at the base of Loudon Heights. Anyone who's driven to Harpers Ferry from Route 340 has seen there's a little like Exxon gas station that sells discount cigarettes and stuff. That was the location of the fight of the century that really wasn't the fight of the century. But
12 minutes of the century.
12 minutes, yeah, the best 12 minutes of the century. But it's a fun story. I laugh about it now every time I go by the gas station. The two fighters actually have an interesting rest of the story. Kant goes back to England, never really makes much of himself. He's never as famous as his brother. He thought this would be his big break, but it ended up kind of being the end of his career. Sullivan will eventually move out west. He goes to California and kind of goes back to his old trade of being an enforcer for political organizations. And he's actually arrested and he dies mysteriously in prison. They find him with his wrists slit in the prison. And to this day, it's never been confirmed whether it was suicide or whether he had been killed by a rival group. But that is the end of Yankee Sullivan. You can't see me right now, but I'm raising my bottle in honor of Yankee Sullivan and the fight at Harpers Ferry.
He punched his way to fame.
Mm-hmm.
I definitely won't view that Exxon Mobil the same way again. If you're going to Harpers Ferry, we're going to Harpers Ferry Brewing. I mean, it's a left to the
right.
the historic site in the national park, a right to the Adventure Center and Brewing. I mean, it's right there, and
it's right there.
Yeah, I have a feeling it's probably not the last fight that's occurred in that parking lot, but
I think we should, as Joe said, we should stage a rematch. Let's get 800 people down there, get two people to punch each other into oblivion. Sounds like a great
applications to be Yankee Sullivan.
We'll have the getaway vehicle ready in case we need to flee
across
the river.
I love it.
I'm gonna can't quit out and see if I can get back in with video. So I'll be back.
We don't need you.
Oh.
Yeah, we got your story.
Oh.
We know the result now of the fight.
No, it's good. Come back.
All right.
You definitely need a rematch. I mean, that's a big money fight. You can't just.
That's what I'm saying. Think about the merchandise sales.
Yeah.
Think about concessions.
Dana White would never stand for that in the UFC right now. He would absolutely book a rematch between you.
So one of Sullivan's next fights after this was supposed to take place on an island in the Chesapeake Bay, and the Maryland authorities found out about it, so they moved it over to the Eastern Shore, and it was broken up by like Maryland militia. They sent like 300 militia to break up. So boxing was a totally different sport back then.
We are going to fast forward here 20 some years. We're going to fast forward to the Civil War. Of course, many folks are familiar with the just droves of history in and around Harpers Ferry during the Civil War. So I'm trying to, hopefully this one will be a bit more of an obscure tale that you guys will enjoy. This is also a Mosby tale. A lot of folks love the Mosby tale. So John Mosby was the leader of the 43rd Battalion of Virginia Cavalry. They were a partisan unit. So they were not operating per usual as other cavalry infantry units were doing. Instead, their main goal, Travis is back. I'll drink to that. To Travis. All right. So Mosby and the Rangers, their main goal is to harass all of the Union lines that are crisscrossing Northern Virginia. And so in 1864, a lot of that movement is centered around the rail lines, supply lines that are heading, in the Winchester direction, going on the B&O to Harpers Ferry, Martinsburg, and then shuffling their way up the valley to where Sheridan is encamped in Harrisonburg by October of 64. And you also have a separate rail line, the Manassas Gap Rail Line, which is further south in Virginia, which is being supplied and run by Christopher Auger in DC, and then he'll move down later on. So Mosby is fighting rail fights on both fronts, basically trying to pick off pickets, trying to make sure that work on the Manassas Gap Railroad isn't done. They have 4 mountain howitzers, so they're just aiming down on the lines, pow, 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 Manassas Gap. But they're also not leaving all of those supply lines to the north that are passing by the valley. And so in October, Mosby and the Rangers, they hear from one of the Rangers who is actually from the Harpers Ferry area, from Jefferson County. They hear that there's actually a gap in supply line protections along the B&O between Harpers Ferry and Martinsburg. And that means that whether it's wagon trains going or regular trains going through, there's an opportunity to snatch something up and to make the United States look like idiots. That being something that Mosby likes to do, he wastes no time in calling together a group of about 80 Rangers and making their way up to the Harpers Ferry area. And so they travel under cover of night, and they kip out just a few miles east of Martinsburg along where the rail line is coming. And Mosby knows that this is not going to be a military train coming through. He is specifically trying to derail and steal from a civilian train line that's coming through. And so this is one of those examples. A lot of folks, Mosby usually followed a lot of the rules of engagement, even though he was a partisan unit. This is one of those examples where the Union papers are going to call him a highwayman and a horse, robber, because he's lying in wait to kidnap supplies of civilians. So it is what it is. He's got the train schedule. He knows that he is expecting a train coming out of Baltimore, and it will arrive in the very, very early hours of October 14th, 1864. In contrast to the boxing match of May 11th, 1840, it is a cool, clear, starry night in the area when they're going to be lying in wait for this train. Mosby sets a detail of 15 men to rip up one of the rails of the train, and everyone else gets to fall asleep on the embankment. Not a bad deal. Meanwhile, in Baltimore at 9:15, the number 27 train pulls out of the depot. On this train there is a car full of German immigrants, speak no English. They're going out to the west to resettle, maybe to join friends and family that live out there already. On this train, we also have a big shipment of the New York Herald, your usual stock. And then you also have a few members of the United States military, not an army, not just some stragglers, just some little guys, including two paymasters of the United States Army. And they're all on train. 9:15, they leave. Throughout the night, they're passing through places where the rail has had other issues earlier. They passed through Monocacy Station, no incident. Everything's in the clear. Just, sometime after midnight, they roll past Harpers Ferry, and there is no incident. But they don't get too much further than Harpers Ferry. They just passed Duffield Station when all of a sudden, 2 o'clock in the morning, the train reels off of the tracks and smashes into the embankment. You can imagine that many of the passengers would have been sleeping at this time. And so they're roused in the dark by screeching, crashing rail cars. The baggage car rams against the engine and the engine explodes. If you've ever seen an exploded locomotive engine, it's bananas. It's like, it doesn't sound cool, but it looks like hot spaghetti spewing out of the front of the engine. Because of all of the compressed metal. Steam pours out of the engine and it scalds the engineer, William Collins, and his son, who are badly burned. In the darkness, in the confusion, in the panic, 2 doors open on the sides of the coach, and Mosby's Rangers are lit up in silhouette against the darkness. That last part is artistic on my part. I don't know. But I like to imagine the door is blown open and you see the Mosby's Rangers, in silhouette coming into the car. Someone actually shouts, "It's Mosby's Rangers." So that becomes a very quick giveaway about what is happening on this train. One of the Rangers the car that he bursts into is the one that has the 2 Union officers in it. One of the Union officers, even though he's like smashed over, he tries to pull his gun and the Ranger shoots him outright. But that will be the only flat out casualty from this night's event. Very quickly, the Rangers pour onto the train and start unloading people, objects, possessions, whatever it is. Mosby himself, he's walking with a crutch right now from a previous injury. Mosby himself is helping ladies get down from the train. What a gentleman, to derail their train and then to help them disembark. So he's helping them off the train. Other Rangers are going up and down to the passengers, shaking them down for watches, money, jewelry, anything of value on their persons. So it's very much a highway robbery, train heist kind of a scenario. They manage to get most everybody off, and Mosby turns and says, "Okay, light it up, light it on fire." And they're about to do so when one of the Rangers points out, "The Germans are still in their car because we don't speak German and they don't understand what's happening here." And so Mosby literally, figuratively says, "Burn it up anyways." What he says is, I'm trying to remember if there's a specific word, light the train on fire and the Dutch will get the idea, something to that effect, these German Dutch. And they do. All of those New York Heralds that were there are very useful tinder. So they throw a bunch of the newspapers on the cars and they just light up the train. We do not know we don't have accounts from the Germans themselves what happened, but we do know they got the idea and they exited the car. So they leave safely. No one is burned alive. While the train is on fire, we have many of the women who were on the train are trying to help William Collins and his son who were badly burned. Mosby and his Rangers then escort all of the men off into the woods and have them stripped down. They're not just taking watches, money, whatever. They're taking their clothes off of them. And like you could say something about how the Confederacy is really desperate in 64, but I think this is more than that. This is part of Mosby's shtick of kind of psychological warfare.
Absolutely.
Nothing is safe. Yeah. Not even your pants are safe from Mosby and the Rangers. So having disrobed all of the gentlemen, Mosby comes back to discover that one of the Rangers had found not only John Riggles, who was one of the paymasters, but a very important box that Riggles had with him, which was, of course, the payload, the literal payload that was meant for Sheridan's army. Dollar bills. It was about $173,000 in United States money.
And that's 173,000, like $1864.
Yes, which calculates to about 2.5 million today. So, and this is just by happenstance. This was just the train that was coming from Baltimore at the right time. Mosby had no idea that this was going to be the case. They were looking for a shakedown. They were looking to make the U.S. look like idiots, and they just happened to get a couple $1 million out of it. While they're celebrating, one of the passengers, one of the men, this is according to, incidentally, the New York Herald, who reported on this, later said that one of the passengers accosted Mosby and said, "Why are you doing this? We're just civilians. Why are you doing this to us?" And Mosby, in a very kind of catchy, sassy way, says, "Well, I think that the United States Army ought to be aware that they're not protecting their rail lines correctly," kind of a line. And that's what the New York Herald publishes. And it's interesting that the New York Herald actually sides with Mosby here and is like, yeah, we knew that this rail line was vulnerable and nobody did anything about it. But I don't know if anyone told the New York Herald that they burned a whole bunch of their papers too. I'm curious if that ever got back to them. So all the passengers are left there on the edge of the woods for the rest of the night until they're rescued in the morning. Meanwhile, Mosby and his Rangers ride away with a big old cash load. They meet up down south, and it comes out to there were about 80 Rangers on the gig. So they got about $2,100 a piece, which in today's money is about $30,000 a piece. But that's a huge payday for them. And according to one source, from then on during the war, nothing was purchased in that area, Northern Virginia. Nothing was purchased in that area unless it was with U.S. money from this raid, is what they're saying, is that was a huge cash influx for the area. Mosby himself denied his cut of the share. He was like, "No, it's all you guys, that's fine." And they called themselves the shareholders from that little, all the Rangers that were part of that, they referred to each other as the shareholders. And there were some other Rangers that were kind of butthurt that they, weren't on that raid and didn't get the money. But as a thank you, many of the Rangers got together, they pooled their money, that they chipped in, rather, I should say, and they bought him a horse, a mare, Coquette, who Mosby said was his favoriteest horse. So it was a much appreciated gift from the men. So that is the tale of the train heist, which I like to think is one of the earliest train heists, in American history. And especially, along the B&O is pretty fun too. But it's a great example of kind of those fun pop culture sassy tactics that the Ranger had, but also goes to prove some of the reputation that he had as someone who was targeting civilians, as someone who was not obeying all of the rules of war, and as someone who was willing to set a train on fire with people on it. I don't know. So I would like to say a toast, and the toast that I would like to say is to William Collins, the engineer.
Oh, was he okay?
He was okay. They survived. I don't think their injuries ended up being life-threatening, but you can imagine when you're the engineer on a steam engine and the steam engine blows, it's air, it's hot air, you're scalded everywhere, kind of a thing. It's really not a cool way to be injured.
It's like the wreck of the old 97. To Coquette, because I love that as a name for a horse.
That's a great name.
Yeah, he had a couple of horses.
There's a cool painting of them giving Coquette to Mosby. I know there's a copy of it in Oatlands because I would stare at it on the wall when I worked there. But
yeah, and as you can imagine, the Rangers just ran through horses all the time. If you were going on a raid, Mosby would bring several horses with him, and so Coquette was on many adventures through the end of the war.
Sure.
And we've had a good back and forth. Michelle asked about Duffield Station and kind of other instances of it is, is part during the war. And then Eric mentioned, the Calico raid.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you want to bring up either kind of like bring those in that location, important other parts of the war?
So there are two Calico raids. One we've talked about before. That's the one on July 4th with the Eagle Cake. But there's another one. It's like, oh gosh, June 29th, 1864. It's like the end of June 64, not, right around the same time, where Duffield Station is taken by Mosby's Rangers.
Correct.
There's like a company of the Potomac Home Brigade there. Most of them get captured and sent to POW camps. But again, it's
which is also an interesting point, that this is where the bald spot had been in the Union protection of the lines. As Eric pointed out, as Travis pointed out, there have already been encounters here all up and down, not just by Mosby and his men, but also when Jubal Early came up this past summer, and screwed everything up between there and Washington. Yeah. And the Calico raids are also interesting because they're again preying on what we would think of as civilian targets, being shops, being mercantile locations, being places that you would raid and take their stuff and then run away. And incidentally, a lot of those shop owners are actually from Virginia. They're from Loudoun County, from our side of the border. So hopefully that answers that question.
Fun fact. Those of you who know John Heckman, the tattooed historian, he does a lot of online programs with us. One of his ancestors was captured at Duffield Station during that action in June '64 and was sent to Andersonville and died in Andersonville. So, John, if you're watching, here's to your ancestor.
Here's a drink. Yeah.
Really interesting site. It's the oldest train station in the United States in existence. So, or train depot.
Right, the
still
depot
in existence.
is, yeah.
To
Duffield Station.
It's a cool site. You should go check it out if you're into trains or if you're into the Civil War.
And if there's a train coming from Baltimore, it probably has $2.5 million on it.
Yeah, so.
We all need a stimulus.
Right, yeah. Are we the shareholders now?
That's right.
Yeah. I think this is a perfect segue, talking about our economic woes. Let's talk more Civil War. Tell me more, Joe.
Yeah, so I try to tell some uplifting or amusing stories, particularly about some of the individuals that I highlight. This is not one of those stories, but I do want to talk about Charles and Fleming Anderson. Charles is the father of Fleming, and they are part of the Loudoun Rangers. We've mentioned the Loudoun Rangers in some capacity in previous episodes, but last week we mentioned, on the Confederate side, the Mosby Rangers, White's Cavalry. The Loudoun Rangers are the counterparts to them, where they are a lot of Loudoun soldiers who are pro-Union. And when the war begins, they stay loyal to the United States. And in the spring of 1862, someone named Samuel Means from Loudoun at Harpers Ferry gets permission to raise a cavalry unit of Loudoun men, but to fight for the United States. And I thought this would be a good story to tell for the Harpers Ferry program. One, because it directly involves the Anderson family, but two, like, if you think of it, if you're familiar with the area from like Harpers Ferry down to Waterford and then up across the Potomac to the Point of Rocks, that kind of triangle is a really critical field in location for where the Loudoun Rangers do a lot of their activities during the war. Yeah. So they get permission, at least Samuel Means does, at Harpers Ferry in the spring of 1862. And they'll do a lot of kind of irregular style of warfare. They really want to protect the loyal Loudouners during the war. They are from the northern Loudoun area, and that's where they'll spend a lot of their time. And there's about 250 men within this cavalry unit during the war. And I can't remember which episode it was, but we've mentioned them previously. And I think "Bless Their Hearts" was the way we described their
war. Was it the epic fails?
If it wasn't, it should have been, because
talked about
like
the Loudoun Rangers. We talked about them in the July 4 thing with the Calico raid and Hobart. We've talked about them. Gosh, when else?
Yeah, they've come up several times. They've never been, I don't think, the point of focus. But yeah, to the
classic Loudoun Rangers style.
Classic Loudoun Rangers.
Like the Scrappy-Doo of the Union Army.
They will live up to "Bless Their Hearts" for 1862 to 1865. And I think what encapsulates that is probably what they're most known for in terms of military record, and that is during the Maryland campaign, where Robert E. Lee is making a raid into Antietam. A huge mistake he makes is he leaves a 12,000-man garrison at Harpers Ferry, has to then detach 2/3 of his army to go deal with that.
Right.
The Loudon Rangers are in Harpers Ferry when Jackson's wing of the army surrounds Harpers Ferry. And the day before the garrison surrenders, there are a few different cavalry units that break out from Harpers Ferry the day before, and the Loudon Rangers are a part of that. So again, it's very fitting that probably their best day of the war is just simply avoiding being captured. And the majority do get captured during the war, and that kind of fits into the kind of fighting that takes place in northern Loudon between them and other partisan units for the Confederate side.
That's what it was, because we talked about Rachel means.
Yes. Okay.
And getting captured and the prisoner thing. Sorry.
Yeah.
Please continue.
Yeah, and again, some of them get captured multiple times throughout the war, so that's not a totally unique thing, especially for the Loudon Rangers.
Right.
At least they avoid it this time, where they do, take part in the breakout of Harpers Ferry right before its capture during that campaign. But as I like to mention, when we think of the war, a lot of times we gravitate towards the battles and campaigns: Maryland campaign, Gettysburg, Manassas. But by and large, soldiers live pretty boring lives during the war. I mean, there's a lot of not much going on, a lot of inactivity. And for the Loudon Rangers, a lot of the times where they are stationed, it's Harpers Ferry, Point of Rocks, or even in Loudon. So they're not far away from a lot of their homes.
Right.
And for example, Charles and Fleming Anderson, they are from the Waterford area, kind of in Taylortown, Waterford. They're some of the first to sign up in the spring of 1862. Fleming, 21 years old when he enlists in 62, really kind of the model type soldier that you think of. His father at 45, much older than the typical soldier during the war, but also signs up for it. Now, during some of this time of inactivity, Fleming does kind of break away from where they're encamped, and he goes in the spring of 1863 to a party around Taylortown, Virginia, near Waterford. And it's at this party that, as Briscoe Goodhart, a Loudon Ranger and future biographer of the unit, he writes about this instance with Fleming, some other officers within the Loudon Rangers, where White's cavalry breaks in and captures Fleming and several other Loudon Rangers that are at this dance and party.
It's a party. I just love the a quaint Victorian party, unless it's one of those like tape measuring parties that Allison Herring told us about, right? Where they're kissing and stuff. I don't know. And then here come the Confederates.
Yeah, and Lige White bursts in through the door.
Yeah, the measuring tape goes away during times of war. But White's cavalry jumps in, and they ruin the party. They come in, they want to capture them. Now, as Briscoe Goodhart writes, Molly Anderson, the sister of Fleming, throws her arms around Major, let me find the name of it, Lieutenant Marlowe of the Confederate Army, and begs them not to take Fleming and send him down to Richmond to maybe potentially Castle Thunder or Libby Prison.
Yeah.
And as he writes, pleads to the lieutenant, and the lieutenant says he'll spare Fleming at least being sent to prison and will parole him if Molly would be willing to dance the next song with him.
Oh.
Wing, wing.
Yeah. And as Emery
measure some tape with him.
Yeah.
As Emery mentioned, she would pass on that option and would send her brother to jail.
That's not cool. I don't know.
I don't know, man.
It's war.
Are we divided
Joe,
on this?
Sorry, my brother Joe. Not gonna happen. Only I choose who I dance with.
So
on the one hand, I get that, but on the other hand, it's like Libby Prison. Like, do you want your brother going there? It's a dance. I don't know.
Yeah, but I don't know what kind of dance it is. I don't know how much touching there's gonna be. There's a difference between like a waltz and a jig. Don't tell me there isn't.
True. You're right. I yield.
Well, Molly takes one for the family.
Good for Molly.
Yeah, she agrees to this dance, of course, and as Goodhart writes, the other Confederate soldiers, take a lady, they dance to it, and Fleming, as he writes, takes the violin and plays The Girl I Left Behind Me for the
Okay.
song. Cool. And from that point forward, Fleming then goes to Point of Rocks, and he is sent to Annapolis to await exchange before he's back with the Loudon Rangers. So again, times of kind of lulls. And after the Gettysburg campaign, Fleming's already back, but Charles and Fleming Anderson, they're at Harpers Ferry now in the fall of 1863. And this is where we don't really know exactly what happens, but this kind of shows the importance of history and a little bit into the field. Because what we do know is something happens on Halloween night on Bolivar Heights where the Loudon Rangers are encamped. I don't know what happens on Halloween, but I do know that the next morning on November 1st, Fleming Anderson finds his father's cap on the ground and suspects maybe this is a prank that's being pulled, maybe it's a joke. So it goes about looking for his father, Charles. Goes a little bit further down Bolivar Heights and finds then his father's pocket watch. And when he finds that, he realizes this is no joke. I mean, this is something serious going on. Where is Charles? And a bit further down the heights, they find his father, as what would be quoted, mashed to pieces. He's dead. Wow. When they find him on November 1st. Now, the question becomes, what happened to Charles Anderson on Halloween on Bolivar Heights? So I looked at a few different accounts and what they say about it. And I think, again, it shows how you can't always believe what you read, but also you got to look at various sources. So one of the first quotes I'll point out, I've got a few here, is from a Loudon Ranger. And what he writes on November 1st, so the day they find Charles's body, he's writing to his uncle. This is Joseph Devine. Dear uncle, Captain Anderson is dead. He fell down over the rocks about 200 feet and mashed himself all to pieces last night. Captain Anderson was a little tight and went out to the edge of the rocks, and we suppose he slipped off. This morning, his hat was found where he started to fall, and the boys, by way of a joke, said that he had fallen down the hill when Fleming started to look after him and found his watch about halfway down, and then concluded it was no joke and commenced to look in earnest. He went down the road, and there he found him lying dead, all bruised and mashed to pieces. There is great many a boys who think that he was pushed over there by someone.
That's also like, how bad would that feel if like you were the one making the joke, like, oh, I probably fell over, and then
your dad fell. Like, yeah.
Yeah, if there was ever again, going back to the noise that we had for the Epic Fouls one, if we could ever bring that noise back, it'd be that moment. The mood probably went down when they found the body.
A little.
Yeah.
That's a bummer. That's too bad.
I do want to point out, I love the use of the term, he got a little tight, because like we make fun of kids today for saying like, oh, they're lit or whatever, or turnt, and it's like, no, it's tight.
Yeah, tight, bruh.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point. So I mean, there's a lot of, you can make a whole Netflix series out of this one letter. What is he saying that what happened to this guy? One is what Travis just mentioned. He's a little tight. Yeah, what does that mean? Of course, it was Halloween night. It's peak Oktoberfest season.
Mm-hmm. He was drinking some pumpkin ale.
Yep.
Yeah. So there's now one rumor that even day saying that Charles Anderson was drunk and he fell off Bolivar Heights, and that's how he died. But even at the end of the letter, though, he's writing, a great many of the boys think that he was pushed over by someone. Mm-hmm. Not disputing maybe he was drunk, but also then maybe adding some nefarious acts involved within this. So a few theories about how he died. So what are some other people saying? Some are very right to the point. Rebecca Williams from nearby Waterford wrote on November 2nd, Charlie Anderson, buried, came to an accidental death on Harpers Ferry. Briscoe Goodhart says November 1st, while camped on Magazine Heights, Camp Hill, Bolivar, Captain Anderson slipped and fell over the heights about 200 feet and was killed. Now, if you look after the war, his widow, Mary Anderson, again, the mother of Fleming, she wants to collect Charles's pension. So I did some digging into what the pension says, because they have to then justify her getting it. What the pension says now, when she was in Kansas in 1867, she claims he was, quote, thrown over the precipice at Harpers Ferry. So pretty right to the point.
That's a bold claim to make without really any evidence.
So she's going all in on the murder part.
Yeah, was
Yeah.
thrown. Yeah.
Not even saying he's killed in action, but going with he was pushed.
Before we move on from Charles, I have a question for you, and I was thinking about this last time we talked. Do we know where exactly they were camped when this happened? Because I'm almost imagining like over on the side where like the hilltop, the old hilltop hotel is, like where it's like that sheer cliff.
Ah.
I was wondering that too, and try to walk around and kind of piecing together where they say on Bolivar.
Right, Magazine Heights.
Right.
That even that is pretty general.
Yeah, I mean what Briscoe says was Magazine Heights, Camp Hill, Bolivar. I mean, it's got to be enough to fall down, and it's got to be enough to be rocky enough.
Yeah.
You know, and
to mash yourself.
Or 200 feet or whatever they said. Like that's a significant drop.
Yeah, so 200 feet, he says. Another one says 170 feet. So there's so we're looking at about 200 feet in terms of what multiple people then report.
So there was measuring tape.
All right, that's it. You're done.
So to add to the drama of, again, the pension after the war, again, Mary, his widow, is saying he was murdered, basically. What she also does is get Samuel Means, the guy who in the spring of '62 got permission to start the Loudon Rangers. He then chimed in Charles Anderson's pension. And what the pension says was, quote, personally appeared Samuel Means, who being duly sworn states that the late captain of the Virginia Rangers and that Charles F. Anderson was killed on or about the 31st of October, 1863 at Harpers Ferry while in the line of duty in the following manner. He was detailed to make out the muster payrolls for said company, and while doing so, engaged at night, he stepped out of his tent and was found dead. He having fell off the precipice, his tent being in about 5 feet of the precipice, that said Charles F. Anderson was sober at the time of his death and of temperate habits.
So that's
sober or not, you shouldn't be 5 feet away from the cliff. I'm sorry.
I feel like that's against regulations, number one. Number two, that suggests to me that there was paperwork in his tent.
Yeah, so he was quartermaster.
Right.
So they're coming, this was in line of work that like, it's almost, he walks out of tent.
Right, he's mid-sentence writing stuff down, and then he gets up and falls off a cliff.
And
that's an OSHA violation.
Yeah, this isn't their first time at Harpers Ferry. But again, on further clue, if you want to find out where exactly this happens, what stands out so much to me is that Mary got Samuel Means to make an account to justify the pension, but in the last line, Charles F. Anderson was sober at the time and of temperate habits. This is years after the war at this point, specifically him stating he wasn't drunk. Which means that it persisted, I assume, that he was drunk and that's how he died. So they, when soldiers are dying during the war, they're not saying in official records and, other things like sober, dead in action. Like, KIA, killed in action, not SKA, not sober and killed in action.
Killed in action was sober.
Yeah, asterisk,
action,
drunk.
Yeah.
So
Lit, tight.
Tight
in action.
Trying to get tight.
So again, what happened to him? I can't say for certain. I think the rumors must have persisted, and on Halloween night that he was drunk, so much so that in the pension they specifically say he was sober.
Would this have any bearing on the pension? Like if it was an accidental death where he accidentally fell versus if he was drunk, would he be somewhat culpable and then like not eligible for a pension?
My guess is, someone can be correct. My guess is he would not have been eligible if he died of, because he's not being killed in action. He's not dying of disease.
Right.
It's not even accidental if it's sober.
Right.
I mean, they're dealing with so many pensions after the war, and pensions are fascinating to look at insights post-war too. But it has to be at least a concern enough in Mary's mind to get Samuel Means to have these things said specifically. So she.
I also wonder, apart from being for the pension, which obviously is very important, I wonder if it's also a matter of like, well, you think my husband was drunk. Samuel Means was under oath and said he was sober. Like it could be just as much to hush the gossip hounds, being like, well,
like an honor kind of thing.
And I believe she went to Kansas after the war, and it's in Kansas where she filed this. But, I mean, Charles is buried 2 days later in the Union Cemetery in Waterford. The family still has ties there. So absolutely, you don't want your hometown thinking that that's how your husband died.
Yeah.
So tough story for the Anderson family.
And it doesn't get better.
It gets worse.
But wait, it's worse.
So a time of grieving for the family, of course. But the war goes on. Fleming, of course, is paroled. He's back after being in Annapolis. Towards the conclusion of the war, now a little over a year after that, for Christmas time, again, they're encamped nearby his family's home. And the family's been grieving after the loss of Charles, so really has the Loudon Rangers. And Fleming gets permission to go to his mother's home on Christmas Eve to celebrate Christmas. They weren't going to deny him nor Mary Anderson, time with their family at Christmas, especially what they've gone through. So Fleming gets permission to go to this, again, Christmas Eve night, 1864. While there's a social gathering at the Fleming home, soldiers surround the house where the Confederate Army of Mosby's soldiers and some of White's cavalry surround the home and then burst into the house, again, Christmas Eve night. Revolvers are brought out. Fleming quickly tries to get out of the chair. He was sitting with a girl he was courting, tries to get out of his chair and go toward the back door. Kind of his belt or something gets stuck on the chair.
His saber.
Yeah.
Yeah, either some sort of sword or his belt. Something gets stuck on the chair, delays him from being able to get up. No dance saves him on this night. He is basically, as soon as he does free himself, he is shot in the head. And a few minutes later, he dies in his mother's arms. And then 2 days after that, so the day after Christmas, Fleming is buried also in Union Cemetery.
Merry Christmas, everyone.
Yeah, that is the ultimate coal under the Christmas tree kind of part for the family here. I mean, miserable Christmas now, of course, for them and for the Loudon Rangers too. And there's other Loudon Rangers there.
It is, I will say, it is really interesting and touching to see their headstones together in the Waterford Union Cemetery. The father and the son buried next to each other, like 6 weeks apart. I don't know, it's really visceral. Yeah,
and I do want to go, and at some point I'll post pictures of their gravestones and kind of put the story more in writing too. Maybe I'll do that around Halloween.
Yeah, I mean, all joking aside, you think of the trauma of like Christmas Eve, he's there with this girl that was like his fiance or, someone that he was, and then his mother, and just to die in his mother's arms like that. I mean, that must have
horrific,
been traumatic.
right.
Yeah, anytime that'd be horrific, especially someone who's already been in grieving.
Right.
And it also blurs, as we know, in this area in Northern Virginia, in kind of your Piedmont area and in Loudon, I mean, the lines are blurred between war and murder. I mean, it's something that's brought up, but it's very much accurate here, where there's a lot of instances that in the stories we've even told in the past, where there is a line between what is war and what is murder. And you see that when you get these partisan groups or these independent units, like the Loudon Rangers that are oftentimes detached.
Like the Loudon Rangers, like Mosby's Rangers, even like the 35th, because there are times that they're operating independent and times that they're operating in the greater, Confederate cavalry.
They are. Yeah.
I mean, we talked about John Moberly a few weeks ago. Another good example of that. Like,
absolutely,
war is so personal in this area. A lot of old scores get settled very violently.
Yeah, and a lot of new scores get made. Like,
absolutely.
And, things like that.
Yeah, and for whether it be the Mosby Rangers or White's Cavalry or Loudon Rangers, I mean, a lot of soldiers are joining these units because they want to protect what they would see as their home.
Right.
I mean, it's not some ideological umbrella that they're fighting for. I mean, they really see this as a home guard in some ways, which is why a lot of them get frustrated when they are, for White's Cavalry, they get lumped into the Confederate Army, and they don't like that in a lot of ways.
Because they don't want to be elsewhere. Yeah, they want to be here.
Yeah. See, like when I talked about Frank Myers several weeks ago, you see some of that within his internal conflict writings.
Or the Loudon Rangers when they're put under the command of the whatever department, and they essentially rebel.
Yeah. And Charles Anderson, before he's killed, or before he dies, and before they get sent to Harpers Ferry in the fall of '63, they do spend time in the Shenandoah Valley. Charles Anderson actually writes a letter to Washington, to petition for them to come back home And what he says in that letter is that Loudoun loyalists, so people who are still loyal to the Union, are, quote, hunted like beasts in the forest, for his pitch to come back and bring the Loudoun Rangers back. That they signed up to protect those who were still loyal to the United States.
And there's some truth to that too, that there was definitely a good bit of bullying going on for the United States enclaves. I mean, when you were talking about Samuel Means, it's one of his businesses was one of the ones that moved to Point of Rocks. Another Waterford resident, John Steer, moved his business and was a victim of the Calico raid on numerous occasions, you know, as different groups are coming through. Just another drive home of protecting your home turf, protecting your own people, but everything being personal.
I mean, how many times does Harpers Ferry change hands during the war? How many times, you know, throughout the entire war does White's Cavalry show up in Waterford and the Loudoun Rangers show up in Waterford? I mean, it's constant. It's such a different war.
Well, it's constant, but it definitely spikes in 64. You know, I would say that, you know, 1861 and 62, there's still this idea that there are rules to war, and this is, you know, this is your home front and this is your battlefield. But at least in our area, it's obviously not the same everywhere. But then when you get into, I would say 63 and 64, it becomes very tit for tat, and the stakes just keep getting higher.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I mean,
this is on the heel of, I can't remember if we mentioned some capacity, but the Burning Raid.
Exactly. But that's the same fall as the train heist.
Yeah, and we look at like Mosby's men being executed at Front Royal, and then Mosby turns around and executes
the train heist, you know, and
federal troops.
Not only that, but the Federals go and they burn down Joseph Blackwell's house, which was the arms store for the Rangers, which is like, that's a person's home, but it was operating as an arms store. So was it civilian? Or did it count as being a military, you know, source? All of those lines being blurred.
Yeah. Yeah, 64 is horrific as far as the Civil War goes. I mean, I'm not a Civil War guy, but, you know, it just really,
like on the Manassas Gap Railroad, when Augur is trying to, you know, resurrect the Manassas Gap Railroad, Mosby and his mountain howitzer keep pounding down on it. So Christopher Augur rounds up civilian prisoners and puts them on the train and says, all right, derail this. And Mosby fired back, I'd put my family on those trains and still derail them. You know, like it's real personal.
A whole new kind of war that you don't really see in 61 or 62.
Yeah, and I mean, there's atrocities at various points and hard fighting, of course, during those first few years. But the desperation is ramped up by 64. But then even too, like I'm now just thinking back to like Frank Myers. So just after Fleming's killed on Christmas Eve, Frank Myers is returning back to the Loudoun area. And it seems like there is somewhat of a truce. We're almost, again, it sounds, people are probably thinking these people are crazy. They're saying it's like the worst part of the war, but then there's also areas of potential truces. But again, that just shows, I think, the tenuous dynamic within the area where at some areas it is blurring lines of war and murder, and you're getting more desperate and you're seeing more villainous kind of acts. But other times, potentially truces, as Frank writes in early 1865, it's one of the more social winners that they have during the war, which makes you think maybe they had come to some sort of truce on a soldier by soldier and very small level too, even though the war has increasingly gone harder and more desperate in terms of the style of fighting, even from communities to big picture.
Yeah, I mean, and you'd think, because that's pretty typical for war times, is that the winter is, you know, a mini armistice, you know, that you kind of dial it back and you buckle in. Shooting someone on Christmas Eve being exception to that rule. But I think that, you know, that's an important thing to point out, Joe. Like 64 to 65, the writing is kind of on the wall for the South, and you can read diary entries from civilians of that time who allude to that a little bit. You know, they write about the fatigue in ways that they haven't written about before, and they're actually starting to feel around the edges of how much longer can we do this. And so I would be surprised if that's part of the same phenomenon, that soldiers are, I don't know, relaxing some of the animosity a bit.
Yeah, and they're fighting it's not like they're saying, well, right into the wall, like we're going home. I mean, for the Loudoun Rangers, they're still a unit, like they get into a pretty large fight on April 6th, where again, bless their hearts, they come on the short end of it. I think with Mosby Rangers on the 6th.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, and the Rangers are still operating up until mid-April. It's on a raid that Mosby sees the newspaper that Lee had surrendered. So it's, I mean, while they may have thought, how much longer can we do this? They're still doing it, especially once we're back in a spring campaign season.
Yeah, and Mosby intends to go down to North Carolina, right? After he realizes that, isn't that his initial train of thought?
There's a whole process to Mosby's disbandment of the Rangers. There's a process to what Mosby wants to do himself. His first thought was to actually surrender the unit. When he heard from Lee, his first thought was, is Lee surrendering? I'm going to bring my unit down to where Lee is. He gets a message to Lee. He sends down one of the Rangers to actually meet with him, and Lee says, go home, rebuild your homes, is what he says, rebuild your state. I know someone out there in the comments will have the direct quote. And so Mosby takes Lee's orders. Mosby may have been a train derailing pirate sometimes, but he obeyed orders that he was given.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so he met 2 different times to try and formally surrender the 43rd, both in the Millwood area, one at Carter Hall and then at Clark Hotel there. And the second time, when they were actually going to sign the papers, there was a noise out in the road, like horses running up, and someone said, it's a trap. And so Mosby ran away, not wanting to be captured. He wanted to surrender, but he didn't want to be captured. And then after that, there was, a bounty, $5,000 bounty put on Mosby's head. His men were allowed to surrender, but he was not. And so he formally disbanded them on April 21st, 23rd, in 65 down in Salem, now Marshall. And his men marched up to Winchester and surrendered. And he was not allowed to. He would have. He was not allowed to. So he was going to go meet up with Johnston's army, but then found out that Johnston had surrendered as well. And so it's after that he ends up being in Lynchburg for a while. He's hiding out at family homes. He's laying low until finally he's able to surrender to Grant himself, because his wife Pauline, Mosby's wife Pauline, intervenes on his behalf, saying, my husband wants to be a citizen again, wants to be a legal citizen again, wants to operate his law firm, just wants to
move on. Yeah.
He just wants to move on. And so, and that's really what sparked Mosby's relationship with Grant afterwards. And he gets an appointment, not through Grant himself, but through that connection, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and I will point out, while the Loudon Rangers don't have a whole lot in terms of their military record to point to, I mean, of course, they obviously get the last laugh. They do muster out at Harpers Ferry, so they kind of come full circle.
Yeah.
Meany gets permission, when they're at Harpers Ferry, to raise the unit. At the end of May, they muster out. Again, they go back to a lot of times Northern Loudon, and again, further full circle. Someone like Frank Myers can't stand when he sees them having flag raising ceremonies and going back with the community and being happy that the war's over and that they were victorious.
Yeah. So in keeping with part of the name, this conversation went off the rails a little bit. Are there any other questions coming in, Joe, that we can address?
Yeah, so one just coming, kind of what we were just talking about. Michelle had brought up, would Mosby have gone to join Johnson or more rogue guerrilla style warfare?
Right.
I think we kind of mentioned that, but if you want to keep going.
Yeah, I'll just flesh out a little bit that's a really good question too, because he did at some point, after trying to go through the proper channels of surrender, he did intend to go join up with Johnston's army and not to stay put and continue waging guerrilla warfare. And I think, again, that's a mark of Mosby as a soldier.
Mm-hmm.
While the fighting got personal, while it was, constant kind of an arms race of who could do the worst thing to each other, Mosby saw himself as doing it on behalf of the Confederate States of America, not on behalf of John Singleton Mosby. And so if there is not a CSA to be working for, if there is not a superior officer to be getting orders from and to be, in regulation with, he was not going to continue on unofficially. And I think that makes Mosby different from a lot of other people who might have been in his same position, not that there were two sanctioned partisan units, but I mean more in terms of people in general, being given that option, being given that opportunity. How many would have stayed the course and be like, you know what, I might be in a regular unit, but I'm still a unit, of this bigger machine.
And I'll throw this out there because I know he's watching. I know Eric Buckland is watching tonight. So if we got anything wrong about Mosby or the Rangers, he's the person
Look
to
up
go
Eric
to.
in the comments and copy him in.
Yeah, if you want to know anything about Mosby or his men, even their post-war careers or any of that, he's the man to go to. He's written a number of fantastic books on the subject. So,
and we have a great number of clips that he did for us, walking us through some cemeteries where Rangers are buried, and we will be getting that content up later this fall. So more context to the Rangers and to Mosby.
Awesome. Yeah, and I promise I will post pictures of Charles and Fleming's graves in the Union Cemetery in Waterford.
Yeah.
And put some of that information into text on Instagram and Facebook for the Loudon Museum. And again, for this whole program, how it started off, tried it in March, had to cancel that. Did it a few weeks ago. Did it, but it rained out. I mean, throw it out.
It got rained in.
yeah.
Nice.
The
It was
nightmare.
classic 2020, causing us problems. But we wanted to tell more unique stories. Of course, John Brown's raid is a key part of Harpers Ferry history and what people think of. For this time, we wanted to maybe tell some of our obscure ones, but hopefully, I would love to do one and maybe focus on some of those John Brown stories too.
There's actually a really fun. This is tangential, and it's just kind of a fun thing that I came across about a Harpers Ferry story. And about the presiding judge being Judge Richard Parker, that has a connection to a story that Joe told many eons ago, is that Judge Parker, let me think. Yes, Judge Parker, who owned the retreat near the Battle of Cool Spring, basically on the battlefield of Cool Spring, Judge Parker and his wife had one daughter, Elizabeth. It was Elizabeth Parker who married what's his face, who was in the duel that you talked about.
Oh, Armistead Mason?
I think she was married to the other guy.
John McCarty?
No, it was Mason. She was married to Mason, who killed his own cousin, right? McCarty. They were related.
They were cousins, and yeah, McCarty killed Armistead.
So there's another Harper's Ferry connection that'll tie in the History on Tap thread too. It's just Judge Parker, who sentenced John Brown to hang. His daughter married Armistead Mason, who killed Mr. McCarty in Leesburg. That was the Leesburg one, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. Well, the duel?
Yeah.
Well, it happened in Bladensburg, Maryland.
That's right. That's right. That's another one where crossing a body of water, state lines. Everything's legal in Maryland, right? You can shoot.
Right, yeah. Everything's legal.
Yeah, and Ken, one of our followers who makes a lot of good comments. I mean, ask something about sources. So, like, for pension records, sometimes, I guess for my story at least, you can sometimes get pension records from Ancestry.com. I did have someone kind of do some digging for me who had an account for that. I also contacted someone who I know has done some research in some of the pensions, who sent me some of the documents that I could look for too. So a lot of the pension records are available if you can't make it to the National Archives. And there's also pensions elsewhere around the country. Some of the information can get through Ancestry, but not all of it when it comes to some of the Union records, at least.
Gold 3 for military records is also great. And a lot of libraries, because of the pandemic, are giving access that for free. Like Frederick County, Maryland libraries offers it. So I think Fauquier County was doing it for a while as well. So that's check it out. Check with your local library to see if you can get free access to these online genealogy and primary source sites.
And if not those records, there are a lot of published records, recollections. Mosby's recollections, of course, are findable, and other historic newspapers are accessible too. Like for the train heist story, both of those were useful.
Go to the Thomas Balch Library in Leesburg for any of your local history needs. They're wonderful. You can make an appointment. For my story, the main source I used was actually there's a small book published on the life and fights of Yankee Sullivan that came out, a few decades after his death that has a tremendous amount of information on the fights themselves.
Do you
And then
remember when Sullivan passed away? Like what decade? When did Sullivan die?
1853.
Oh, okay. So it wasn't that.
Like it wasn't that long after the fight. It was like a decade or less after the fight at Harpers Ferry.
Because he was a young dude, you were saying.
He would have been. We don't know his exact birth date. I said 1811, but some sources say 1813. So he was in his 30s during the fight. Wow. It would have been in his 40s when he was either killed or killed himself. Died under mysterious circumstances. The way I see it, we have two cold case files we need to solve right now: the murder of Yankee Sullivan and what happened to Charles Anderson at Harpers Ferry. So
you're on tap, true crime edition.
Yeah, we're gonna make this like a Scooby-Doo mystery show.
So what do you all have going on with Virginia Piedmont coming up? Anything?
Tomorrow.
Tons of stuff.
Tomorrow evening, 5:30 to 7:30 is our first iteration of Drive-In History. It's a drop-in program, so you don't have to come at 5:30. Come whenever you have a chance. And we'll have two historians there talking about World War I history in the area, and Travis actually put it together.
Yeah, so we're going to have some living historians talking about the American experience on the Western Front. They're going to be there in uniform with all the weapons, the equipment, and really zeroing in on stories of local people from Loudoun, Fauquier, Clark County, the Piedmont area who went away to war, serving on the Western Front in 1918. So it's like Anne-Marie said, drop in. So anytime between 5:30 and 7:30, stop by. We're going to be keeping good social distance, but ask questions, bring the kids. It'll be a family-friendly thing. If you've never been
to our office before, it's a great chance to see it. We're out in Atoka on Route 50. You can bring a picnic dinner. There's plenty of space, as Travis said, to space out. It should be a really nice, friendly evening.
As long as it doesn't rain.
Yeah.
What about Loud Museum?
Yeah, so again, we are continue to be open to the public Friday through Sunday. I got delayed last week. The hurricane kind of delayed some of my plans to shoot the Pour Over History again with Dr. Esposito. Karina we had on in our last program. We talked about Confederate emigration to Brazil. We had a delay from last week, but I do plan to work with her to get it filmed within this week, and then I'll post that to the Loudon Museum page. If you have any questions from Karina being on History on Tap from a few weeks ago that you want me to bring into the conversation, let me, because we haven't filmed it yet. We'll posting that soon. And then next Thursday, I believe it's official, we are doing another History on Tap in person. Travis, remember, you want to?
Yeah, so we'll be at Oatlands Historic House just south of Leesburg on 15. This event, we're outdoors. It's not at a brewery location, so there will not be beer on tap to pour. So please pack a picnic. Again, bring family. This is one that's unique since we're not at a brewery. You could bring the kiddos too. We're still going to be telling true stories from history, but it'll be a great opportunity to be out at a local institution, to be spread out. And our theme for next week is going to be stories from in and around Oatlands, just that area kind of by the Goose Creek.
Yeah, a beautiful property. Leave your pet at home. I think no pets, but yeah, no glass.
Pets. No glass containers.
Yeah. Bring picnic chairs, non-glass containers,
Yep, it'll all be outdoors on the lawn. The gardens will be open. There are restrooms on site. So it should be, we're hoping it'll be kind of a fun, like pop-up picnic history, kind of a version of history.
We're saying roughly from 6 to 8.
Yep, the event is from 6 to 8. We'll begin speaking at like 6:30. So you've got time to come in and set up your spot.
Yeah, and enjoy the beautiful scenery. And the comment section is buzzing with Travis and Christopher mentioned he's wearing his dedicated History on Tap shirt. What he means by that, you can go in the comment section yourself and read.
Oh,
but
God.
Oh boy,
I can't wait to see this.
The public is demanding we make a Historians on Tap t-shirt, so maybe we'll have to get that in the mix pretty soon.
Oh,
we can make that happen.
So again, just going on what the comments are saying. It's bring your own picnic. What that picnic is, it's your own design, but it can't have glass containers. And we'll leave it at that.
Yep.
All right, we did it. We did Harpers Ferry. Again, we got the rain just like at Harpers Ferry. We really recreated it well.
Yes.
Hopefully no rain next Thursday.
Yeah, and Travis didn't disappear on us.
No, I will not freeze up live and
Or maybe he will.
disappear.
Maybe we will. Maybe
Join
we'll.
live to find out.
Let's do one final cheers to all of you guys for coming back out on the internet to see us.
Cheers.
Absolutely.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
everyone.
guys.
We'll see you again soon.